So my name is Susan Anderson, and I'm very pleased to be able to chair this webinar. Just a little bit about IORMA before we start. IORMA Consumer Commerce Centre is a neutral resource for business and governments, and it recognises the need to understand and respond to the ways that the 7.8 billion global consumers are changing in the products they want, the services they want and need, and the ways they want to obtain them. And these changes are happening globally, and they're happening now. Today, we're going to look very much at the challenges and opportunities in terms of what's happening in the labour market, what's happening in the workplace in terms of skills. There are challenges, but there are opportunities, and we're going to look at those both in the medium and the short term, but also looking to the future. What does the future hold for us? So we've got three very eminent contributors today. We've got Wendy Cartwright, who's chair of the advisory board for the Global Diversity Practice. She's also a trustee for the Armed Forces Covenant Fund. She was previously HR director for the Olympic Delivery Authority, and more recently she was HR director of the Houses of Parliament Restoration and Renewal Fund. That must have been challenging. David Smith is Chief Executive of Global Futures and Foresight. He's one of the world's leading futurologists and strategic thinkers, having founded GFF in 2006. And before that, David held numerous strategic roles, including Strategic Marketing Director for Unisys's $2 billion global financial services business. And he's widely sought after as a professional futurist and speaker, and he's addressed over 450 conferences and events in 42 countries over the last 10 years. Tom Hadley is an external consultant, and he runs global business and employment practices. That's Hadley's comment. He's an independent consultant and business coach. He specialises in government relations, reputation management and workforce issues. And over the last 20 years, Tom has worked with global employers, international institutions, government ministers, and two of the UK's leading business organisations. So over to you three. We're going to start with David. And David, tell us a bit about how you see the future. What are sort of topics that are really grabbing your attention at the moment?
Okay, all right. I just want to very quickly talk for the next 4 or 5 minutes about some of these thoughts, rather than give you the sort of massive view of how I see things changing. Number one, something that's become true over the number of years is tomorrow is not a version of today. So using the rearview mirror to predict what you need to do for the future is actually probably riskier than doing nothing at all. So it's a time now to be creative, be prepared to change the way you do things. I think it was an organization recently said 90% of jobs created will require digital skills. And that's at the easy end of things. The more interesting end of things is by the end of this decade, I think most senior executives who were interviewed said, I think it was 60-odd% that they'd have to replace a quarter of the skills in the organization or a quarter of the staff. So you think about the amount of difference that the end of this decade will have to where we are now. It's a time of inflection. Inflection is also a fantastic time of opportunity. Rather than looking, whatever I say in the next few minutes, it's all about opportunity. It's not about the end of things. It's the beginning of new things. And I want that to come across loudly, because that's what we're brilliant at doing as human beings. So we may see things coming to an end, and we're not very good at imagining the new things, but they will appear, and we will address them, and we will take on new roles and jobs. So the good news about the pandemic, and there's only one bit of good news, the rest of it is we've all lived through, we understand, is that tech has emerged as one of the heroes in one of the most prosaic areas, PC-based video conferencing that most people thought was a nice to have rather than a necessity going forward. It's kept people in work, it's kept people connected, it's allowed us to do many, many things. So the things we thought would be impossible have turned out to be possible, and in some areas quite pleasant. It's kept us engaged with school, it's kept us engaged with work, it's kept us engaged with each other. And we looked at sort of 40 industries back in May, at the beginning of the pandemic, which was a long time ago now, and we could see sort of 40 industries and how they're likely to change as a consequence. So the point is looking at the change that's occurred, because our attitudes change is probably as important as the individual components that have changed as we move forward. As I say, shopping's changed. I think we're about 11-12% now. We were 7% before the pandemic. And the bottom line is that, this is grocery shopping's a really prosaic area of our lives. It would be much higher if we had the capacity. So many of us have learned that online shopping, online payments, doing things online actually works quite well. And many of us were resistant to that before. So there have been a lot of new changes of attitude and behavior that'll take us beyond the pandemic, that will accelerate things like work and where we work and how we work and where we live in order to work. So spatial economics is likely to change, and a lot of other dynamics as we move forward. So health, of course, is suddenly become one of the most important elements of our thinking about looking ahead. It always was, but it was, if you like, subconscious, whereas now it's very much in our consciousness, and it will be for the next couple of years. Telehealth, remote health was always on the horizon. It's now here and here to stay in a more dynamic way, which moves the work around the world. Who are you getting your medical advice and service from? Where are you engaged? Is it the local GP, or is it somebody in India or Indonesia or elsewhere? What are we doing? And that's becoming more technologically capable. Where are we doing the work that engages with us in terms of health, work, education, entertainment, etc.? Number one, if you like, tech. Number two, globalization. It always was going to be a new globalization, not the outsourced, remote, follow the labor market. Because now you look at AI, artificial intelligence, in very many cases, it's replacing volume of workers for capacity to increase your output as a nation. So we've got new elements that are collaborating to allow us to do things differently and not just simply follow old models of getting things done low price. At the same point, 3D fabrication, 4D fabrication, which is the integration of 3D fabricated components to fully working components, if you like, is much more to do with end product. And the benefit of that is not just it can build your house for very, very low cost, 70% less cost and probably better quality, because that's already been proven. Dubai is committed to 25%, I think, of new housing will be done with 3D fabrication. Britain barely talks about it as a possibility, and it's quite ridiculous. Our building regs are what stop the innovation in that space. So it's reusable, it's deployable now, and you can build a 800 square foot house, which is relatively modest, for about $4,000. So we're talking about order of magnitude different economies of scale for housing. The whole real estate world changes as a consequence. And just the last point, I guess, new technologies such as Internet of Things, Internet of Nano, that's barely taken off, but I think it was one of the big consulting firms said it's transformative in the next 2 years, and that's 2022. So everything will be quantified. The worker may be quantified permissively. Our environment may be quantified. Our customer may be quantified. Our whole supply chain may be quantified. So we start actually interrogating the real world as if we interrogate the digital world. And that allows us to do things different. So with all that, we need sort of explainers to old style folk, what does all this mean? We need maintainers to keep it going, understand how to implement it. And of course, we need to train people to work with it. So those are three massive categories of new work. And finally, and more importantly, we need the leadership mindset change to allow us to embrace these models. And then we can look at these sunlit uplands of opportunity rather than the troughs and furrows of end of life of some industries and sectors. So that's my thoughts just for sort of 5-minute kickoff, if that's okay.
Really helpful. Wendy, what about you? How do you see the challenges and opportunities?
Yeah, so similar to David's position, I think there's a lot that's been already written and sort of interrogated around. We're in the middle of a crisis at the moment. What does it look like coming out of this situation and facing the future? And I think that's a lot of the way that organisations have been able to a certain degree control their own agenda, notwithstanding the VUCA world and all of that stuff that's been in existence, with rapid change being the case and not always controllable. At the moment, organisations have found themselves in a situation that they haven't anticipated. And so I think the situation is a mixed picture, as there are lots of organisations that are on the brink now of insolvency, or and we can expect some of that. We can also expect a great deal, as David was saying, looking at the positives. Organisations have had to have a long, hard look at themselves and say, this has not worked. So what we've seen is acceleration of the pace of change in areas where some organisations have been sluggish for all sorts of reasons. So it's proven the art of the possible in many respects. But also businesses have had to sort of strip back, look at their core business, which happens in any kind of crisis situation, but it has happened in a way that hasn't quite sort of pushed the agenda kind of pre-COVID. So it is in some respects another crisis, a bit like the banking crisis in 2008 or previous sort of shocks. I think if you couple that with Brexit, and what that means for what we've seen particularly in the early days of the pandemic, where we were overly reliant on supply chains globally, and what we've got now is sort of a push back now. I think there'll be some more onshoring. Businesses that will be global will continue to be global, but the questions around what should we manufacture, what is our kind of critical infrastructure, where should we not be reliant on the rest of the world, I think that's been thrown into sharp relief. I mean, and there are ongoing conversations around fisheries and impacts on businesses that are very real at the moment in terms of the Brexit, and these things will play out over time. But also, I read a recent PwC report that said that there's 7.6 trillion pounds of capital reserves that global companies have got in particularly in kind of consumer FMCG areas, that they're just ready to invest. So you can expect to see mergers and acquisitions and a kind of that kind of pace of change. So big change in certain areas, recalibration in other areas. Again, today, very topical, the government talking about changing its position. The same sort of conservative approach to managing public sector has changed over the course of the pandemic, will change, because again, the kind of the way that in which the public sector will want to engage with the private sector on the core issues of social care and so forth. These are now questions around how we adapt the future workforce and jobs in this country and globally. So I think those are kind of key issues. In terms of the kind of working patterns for the future, again, completely echoing what David said, those people that have been enjoying working from home or enjoying those different working patterns, we need to do more as organisations around that flexibility, around kind of the flexibility of time, when can you work, where can you work, the kind of more hybrid models. And we're simply not up to that just yet in terms of the way that management and output based and productivity works. So I think there's quite a lot for organisations to do that, but lots of opportunities there. And I think that some of the things that we've not done very well and have been continually issues are around investment in line management, investment in skills, soft skills and transferable skills. There's a really important question around that, and what do we mean for kind of leadership and values and all of those things, resilience, adaptability, all of those things. So technical skills, yes, we'll need to absolutely invest in that, and that will need to flow through from a kind of overarching industrial economic strategy that organisations and can be pushed from more entrepreneurial environments too, in terms of, but we need to think about those skills. Where are we going to get them from? How do we help people re-enter the world of work at different points in their careers? How do we get the young people into work? This week is National Apprenticeship Week. That all of those kinds of things where organisations will need to plan and think about different scenarios, different ways of doing that. And there's lots of practical ways, I think, that we can all engage in that. And not wasting a good economic crisis. I think in terms of sort of pushing and thinking about the future. Thanks.
Yeah, and without misstepping as well, there's lots of opportunity to misspeak and misstep. And we have to remember that we're still in a world where there's a lot of uncertainty and there's a lot of personal problems in terms of the mental health aspects for many individuals, and financial worries as well for many. So and indeed, if we look at the UK as a whole, we've seen that the impact of this pandemic has been felt, more particularly in certain sectors, certain parts of the community, in certain nations, indeed. So it behoves us to, whilst we're looking for the positives, also to remember there's been some very significant negatives. Tom, let's have your perspective.
Yeah, hi everybody, good to be with you. Hope the sound's okay and image is okay. I'm not a cat. Everybody's a bit paranoid now about checking any filters on, but I did double check. Just to segue from the two previous opening salvos, a lot of my work at the moment is quite global, so working with the International Labour Organization. And what's interesting is a number of the challenges that we face in this country are shared across different regions across the world. One of those is, of course, preempting evolving skill needs. So a lot of employers I speak to are trying to get ahead of the game on that. So how is our business going to evolve? What does that mean for the workforce? But also looking at other factors like demographics within your workplace and immigration. So immigration is a big topic here, but it is in other countries as well. So some of these external factors are coming into play. Another one is around the inclusion and diversity agenda. So globally, a lot of the businesses I speak to are at the stage that it's not good enough anymore to have positive intentions. It's about making change happen. So how do you go about doing that whilst recognizing that making tangible change can take a bit of time? So that inclusion agenda is a global one. And then the last two, which I think are interesting, is the remote working, flexible working agenda. And this is a genuine debate, isn't it? I don't know what you guys find, but when you speak to employers, some say actually it's great, the engagement of staff is fine, productivity is fine, it's really going well. Others are a little bit more skeptical. So I think it's a live topic that's out there. How do you continue with flexible work, remote working, even in the post-COVID era, whilst maintaining culture, cohesion, engagement, etc.? So that's a live topic. Be interested to get people's views on that. And one of the final ones in terms of global challenges is this one around mental health. So even before the crisis, I spoke to a lot of employers who are like, we want to move things on. Yes, we do Mental Health Awareness Week, but how do we sort of embed things more fully? And that's only going to continue. So I think it's there's a huge imperative for employers to really be thinking about this. It taps into the productivity agenda, but also it taps into the employer brand agenda and increase. And it's quite topical on the, and I know IORMA webinar that one of the themes that I'm seeing emerging is employees seen as consumers. And being treated to that extent. So that's an interesting one. I think on the global level, what's interesting is all the priorities for all of us playing globally. What it gives us is an opportunity to see.
Tom, you're cracking up a bit. Sorry, I might have to pause you there a moment. Yeah, your picture's frozen as well. No doubt you'll come back. I think so. There's lots of common themes that have been emerging from your contribution. So, thank you very much for that. Let's start at the top of the organisation. I mean, we're talking about skills. We're talking about strategic thinking, focusing on outcomes. How much do we really believe that those at the most senior level within businesses are really aware of the extent of the challenge and up for that challenge? I mean, let's just, David, start with you. Do you think that the board really is really up to the challenge themselves?
It's very hard to generalize, isn't it? Because some folk are and some folk aren't. But to be honest with you, you normally rise to the top of any reasonable size organization by running things well. Yeah. And you don't get there by having a flash of an idea 10 years in your past. That doesn't work that way. So actually, it's extremely difficult, as you well know, when you get to the board, to suddenly become dynamic and to suddenly start thinking in imperfect access to imperfect information. I.e., it's about the future. Sorry, Tom, he's asking a question on something. Well, give you.
Yeah, that's fine. Sorry, I popped out there for a minute.
Don't worry, I'll just finish this off if I may.
But go.
But essentially, what we have a tool called Entrepreneur Leader Manager, which is available on from our website free. So go and find it in our services section. It allows you to find out where you are on the continuum between entrepreneurially creative minded to operational management minded. And that tool will give you feedback immediately on where your head is. And when it was first created for me, something 7 or 8 years ago, I was hideously skeptical about it being anywhere near too accurate. I am now more than happy that it's hideously accurate, and it tells people a lot. And where boards have done it, and not that many have done it, because obviously as soon as you do it, they all know they've done it, and they want to know what each other's scores are, and everyone wants to be an entrepreneur, which by the way would be horrible if a board was made up of entrepreneurs. That's an utter place where you should see diversity. But you do need some people in there who are willing to believe that things won't remain the same. I think it's Drucker, last comment, Drucker said this, that most firms fail because the basis on which they were created and run is no longer relevant. So you can have the highest customer advocacy score, but then the customer go and find something better from somebody new. So that's where we are in the state of play. I would argue that there are so many strands changing the way we operate that it's now the time to think differently about what the future has in store. I think some are getting it, to be fair. Some are not. Some are playing lip service to it. Some are truly embracing it. But unless you empirically measure this and actually have a debate about who wants to join in that conversation, you're not really doing anything more than making it look good for your investors and analysts.
Very, very, very good points, David. I think you did actually share that strategic tool with us earlier on, and I know Wendy completed it, and it was fascinating. So it would be great if we could post that so that people can do it themselves. I think it's very illuminating. I found it interesting and challenging, actually. I didn't come out where I expected to, but Wendy, what do you think?
Yes,
you worked for the Olympic Authority. I mean, that was a real based on outcomes, but a lot of strategic thinking needed there.
Yeah, and so thank you. So I think where we are today, so just to sort of comment on the tool that David talked about, is I'd recommend doing it. It's a very useful way of sort of getting a bit of self-learning fairly quickly, but this kind of dimension of leader, manager, entrepreneur, I think absolutely chimes within a business context, and we need a balance of those. The other model that I like thinking about is leaders as leaders, managers and coaches, and knowing the different dimensions that you need to move around in. So back to that point about soft skills and the kind of questioning and the kind of leadership, the authority, for all sorts of reasons, this crisis and other dynamics that are going on is sort of called into question this kind of slightly old-fashioned notional value of kind of charismatic leadership, need gravitas, etc. We have seen leaders become more vulnerable. We have seen board members having to run board meetings from their bedrooms, those sorts of things, and actually weirdly, and I think that again, one of the positives to come out of it, all organizations that I've spoken to or read about said that their engagement levels have gone up. Because people feel that actually you're making more of an effort to communicate, and you're making more of an effort to get that kind of two-way back up and down. And also, people who work within your organizations are very sort of mindful of the fact that this is difficult, and grateful that there's a degree of humanity being shown, common sense, support, etc., on all of those things. So I do think I think it's been a good challenge, and those that are good leaders have responded to that, and not always easily, actually. I think in terms of the way that we do business and what it means for the future, again, conversations that I was on another kind of webinar not that long ago with a number of very big kind of global players, who were talking about their experiences, and the person who was chairing that was a chair of very many different companies that quite big, in FTSE and others, and quite openly said, you know, we'd been looking at our business continuity plans just before, and we'd been talking about moving into, you know, which is the office that we're going to have that's going to be our backup for our kit. And had, you know, they went back over those kind of lessons learned and the write-up. Somebody in that meeting had said, what about if we went totally remote? And everybody went, oh, we can't do that. So there was a lot of, you know, very positive, I suppose, challenge, and a lot of very senior people who have had to work in ways that they otherwise wouldn't. So I think that that's been a really good and positive thing. And I think it does challenge us to think about what's then required for the future in a slightly different way. And everything, in my view, I mean, I work in HR, so why wouldn't I say that? Everything comes from the top down. It's all about getting the right leadership in, and it needs to be authentic. I think the challenges actually will come from, you know, at the moment, if you know, if you're in an organization where you can work from home, you should work from home. When we go into the new world, what does that look like? And back to the thing, you know, those that have been most disadvantaged in those areas have been people that have been working in very, you know, small, you know, flats, you know, the younger people potentially, you know, the younger professionals who would have otherwise benefited hugely, and we from being in the office, from learning by, you know, just more informal learning, and also I've heard it said many times, and I agree with this actually, is that when you're all working remotely, that's different from when you're in a kind of hybrid thing. And what we've seen previously, this whole thing about presenteeism being seen in the office, you know, all of those sorts of things, I think we have to think really carefully about that. And again, everything that I've seen.
Let's come on to that whole flexible working. Let's just stay really at the challenge and the top, really. And, you know, as you said, authoritative leadership, authentic leadership, actually, but it's also, you know, building that team at the top that have got the broad spectrum of skills. And I think the whole thing you're raising about resilience, about you know, the precariousness of the nature of some jobs, particularly at the lower end of the labour market, which we're still going to need those people. They're still going to be doing those jobs. But let's just park that for a minute. Just want to bring Tom in on this, you know, whether we think that the leaders at the top, I mean, the English leaders internationally, Tom, whether they're ready for the challenge, whether they're really responding to it. I mean, you know, before this whole crisis, you know, only 35% of leaders believed that digital technology was a challenge. I mean, I'm sure they know that now, but, you know, what's your experience from your contacts, you know, internationally as well as in the UK?
I think the game is changing. When I was at REC, we did a white paper on the future of leadership, and it was interesting. So the two conclusions that came out of that were future leaders are going to be empathetic and people-centered, and two, able to deal with a challenge and a crisis. And that was before COVID. So it's been a real test of both of those features. I think the game is definitely changing. I was reflecting on this actually, and not just your senior leaders, but middle managers. What's one of the barriers to doing some of the things that need to be done? And often it's time, isn't it? And I think increasingly what we'll start to see is you just got to ring fence time and put more focus on the people side of things, workforce management, how you bring the right people in the first place, how you develop that general cohesion. I hear a lot about collective energy. So, and all these things are massive actually. So I think there is something about a reboot in terms of what leaders and managers look like in the future. And that also has implications for when you're hiring people from outside, doesn't it? So bringing people in perhaps more on attitude and potential than before. That's been talked about for a long time. One thing that I am starting to see, which is a good thing, is more employers actually acting on that. So people have talked a good game about hiring on potential, hiring on attitude, etc., while still maintaining the same selection methods. And that's starting to change. And I think that, again, will be something that accelerates over the coming years.
Yeah. So we're all agreed then that, you know, the importance of those softer skills, and that's not just at the senior level, it's at all levels within the organisation. I mean, interestingly, when people are asked what the barriers are to training and reskilling, and that doesn't matter what level you're at, it's, you know, it's about time and the time to do it.
Yes.
It's about motivation. You know, do you see the need? And sometimes it's about distance. But I mean, I think we've learned from this is that actually that needs the criteria. You know, we can.
Perhaps, Susan, just one anecdote, because I think the challenge is some of the jobs that we have out there are basically undoable. And I was speaking to one recruitment professional, and they're saying, I'm getting job descriptions that come through and you're meant to be line managing, but you've got all this other stuff. And essentially it's 2 jobs. And I think there is something about being realistic and saying, if we want people to focus more on the people side of things, we need to make sure that their job description makes that feasible. And I'm seeing a lot of jobs which essentially when you read are undoable at the current time.
That's a very interesting perspective, Tom. Yeah, I think, yeah, I've just been asked to provide a reference for somebody, and I thought this, you know, this person doesn't exist that you're asking for out there. And, you know,
Susan, can I make a comment as we're going to start, or at least we're just leaving talking about the very top of the company? Knowing where you're going to be or where you think you'll be in the next 5 years puts this all in perspective. Because if you just look about automating what you're already doing or changing the roles of what you're already doing, then that's only half the issue. The other half is probably the more fundamental half is, what is your business going to be looking like in the next 5 years? And it's hard to get it exactly right, but if you've got an attitude that says, look, I'm a Philips, I used to make consumer electronics. I'm in the health industry and I'm dropping my consumer electronics business. Well, how big is that? You know, Nokia used to be into trees and rubber Wellington boots, then copper cable, then into smartphones. But it wasn't, it was into telephones, and it couldn't bring itself to move into smartphones. It became corporate and unwieldy and profitable and successful, and then stopped thinking it had to change. So the number one issue at the top of the table is not what skills do I think I need to acquire, or what do I need to change around the organization as it is. That, of course, is important. But far more existential is how do I know I'm going to exist? What makes me think I'm going to be in business in 5 years? What am I going to be doing? And then you can start thinking, well, what skills and capabilities and geographies am I going to need? And that's far more important. That's the number one question. When I get stuck at a board level talking, you know, and then we all look at each other across a virtual desk now. I say, okay, go on, what's your vision? And a vision normally is doing more than they already do in the same space. So I just want to do more of what I'm doing, bigger, better, faster, quicker, cheaper, more profitable. Okay, I say, well, what's your vision? And they go, well, that's it. No, it isn't. That's what your analysts want to know, and that's a good thing. You want to be bigger. I get that. What's your vision? And that's your issue. A lot of firms actually haven't got a vision. So they can't inspire the Gen Z. They can't inspire people to come alongside them because they don't actually know what they want to be, because they actually don't want to be anywhere. Because a vision, last comment on it, a vision is somewhere else. To go somewhere else is risky and difficult and hard and uncertain. And a vision isn't just to grow. That's you got to do that. That's the COO's job. Of course, you want to do all those things, but at the CEO level, where am I going? What are the big bets? Where am I going? Then I think about my partners. I think about how I resource it in one way or the other. So just to put that in my perspective, that's probably fundamental.
Yeah, and that's, to be honest, that's the hard bit, isn't it? I think anybody can, you know, strive to do what they're doing better.
Yeah, cool.
You know, it's why some boards very much, well, they want people like you, David, don't they? They want people to come in to try and, you know, bounce around and come up with those that thinking that really leads to a step change. You know, they all talk about wanting that discordant view from the edge, you know, that they want to have, you know, collaborate in order to innovate. And if it was that easy, we'd all be doing it, but somehow it's not happening.
My last comment to give you some fact on that: a top 2 real estate firm in the world, put it that way, a little bit of an anonymity in that, asked us to look into office space in the end of this decade.
Yeah.
And we wrote in 2013 a very clear message that they need to only take on board, either as managers or owners or builders or designers, offices that can be converted into other uses that would include residential. 2013. Yeah. They loved it so much they had me address their clients at their conference. That was a few months later. I was their keynote speaker, and they never published it. So the point is, you know, you can get as much advice as you like, unless you've got the attitude that says, I need to start thinking about that as one of the bets I need to make. Then you become irrelevant, and irrelevance isn't bad. It lets others take your place. And so as long as you tell the shareholders you're planning to go bust or be taken over in 5 years, there's nothing wrong with that. That's a reasonable strategy. but you can't expect a miracle to happen and suddenly you're top dog when, unless you're someone like Microsoft who just buys themselves back into the industry all the time because they've got so much cash. Most firms haven't got it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, another example, look at BHS. They had some of the best people in the fashion retail industry, and they didn't want to be part of it anymore.
But did you see the uptick on online sales in their space over the last 15 years?
Yeah.
It was a screamingly obvious annual increase in online business. You'd have to be a complete idiot not to notice that the share of sales at Christmas, the share of sales through the year, every single year for 15 years increased. You just don't want it to be true. I get that. That's fair enough.
Oh, yeah. And we had a chief executive there who was seen as, in his time, as a charismatic, leader. But, hey, anyway, let's not. Okay, so Wendy, what I mean, what have been the things that you've, really taken, over the last year? Then, really, when you're looking forward, what do you see, as the real, the real things that are going to make a difference in terms of, encouraging that strategic thinking, that thinking outside the box?
So I think that kind of having the sort of purpose of the organisation and enough boundaries so that people know where they're heading. So have the vision and the mission, at least sort of the shape of that. And so I've been involved in 2 major programmes, and you may kind of know where you're going to end up on the general purpose. People in some respects think, oh, well, that's easy because you're going from A to B, but of course you aren't, because you're interfacing with stakeholders or communities or multiple other organizations with other other considerations, including changing technology. So if you're doing a major program now, be it kind of Crossrail or Tideway or High Speed 2 or any other, you're actually building something physical, and you don't know what is going to happen in the technology changes that you're going along. So you have to kind of have sufficient overarching strategy as a program. And then I think that the key thing around that is that, you've got to have tight control of, time, cost, quality, outputs, because they're delivery focused, right? Otherwise, just never end or deliver anything. But also what I'd learned, particularly at the Olympic Delivery Authority, but I've seen it in other organizations, is building in the timescale that says, if I, these are the really big risk decisions that are going to pop up in kind of 2 or 3 years time. If you're doing, for example, underground in power lines, which was, the thing on the Olympic Park, that's got a whole risk profile attached to it and a timeline and an interface thing that you can't mess with. So it's knowing what those big things are, and then, but also then knowing that you've got a period of time where, particularly in respect of kind of people and dynamics, where you've got a timeline that you have to kind of be able to say, right, I'm going to make a decision now. These are the decisions that need to be made at this point, work back from that. And in many organizations, that can be a kind of 6 to 9 months timeline. In other organizations where you're looking at, again, in the construction sector now, for example, a lot of people that have otherwise worked in the UK have gone to work abroad. Will we have sufficient, pipeline? What about, for example, in heritage trades, for example, at Palace of Westminster, that was a big thing. It wasn't necessarily a big thing in other things. So you have to do sufficient strategic mapping of that in your own areas, I think, and that's the kind of technical professional, and and then invest in apprenticeships and, get ahead of the curve. We're also seeing a lot of kind of collaboration around that space now. Sort of bringing together for various reasons in different ways. But I do think that the whole thing about kind of flexibility, agility, and scenarios, those are, so you've got to have the right mindset for that, and you've got to have leaders that are prepared to say, I just don't know, but this is where we're going, and I'll tell you as soon as I can. And that, and also I think one of the things that I'm really strong on as well is delegate down to the lowest possible responsibility within organizations, and that means kind of trust and empowerment and all of those things. I don't, is that?
That's what I think is really helpful. So we're sort of moving on, aren't we, onto this flexibility sort of agenda. I mean, and flexibility has to be a two-way street. I mean, there's, I think resilience is something that I think you've all mentioned. but it's been never more important, really. It's resilience. I'm talking about resilience amongst individuals now rather than organisations. But actually, if you're not building resilience amongst your workforce, the resilience of the organisation is going to suffer. But at a time when we're all working online, we're all there's an awful lot of pressure on employees to deliver those outcomes. But I think there is a feeling, and I think it's a feeling now, that actually, despite all those surveys showing that people feel more engaged, in some ways, working at a distance is actually undermining some of that resilience that we need. I mean, Tom, what's your perspective? I mean, obviously, having worked so long in the recruitment agency, the agency sector, a sector where it was all too easy for the workforce to feel like third-class citizens rather than a valued, interim execs coming in. How have you seen things change?
That's an interesting one. So I think the demand for temporary contract staff is high at the moment, and you'd probably expect it. So going back for that need for agility, in fact, I think it's 26% up compared to this time last year. So demand for temporary contract staff. So that is a tremendous benefit for businesses, isn't it? The fact you can bring in staff even in times of uncertainty, you can get those skills in very quickly. That's a positive. But I think you make a good point about from the worker perspective. Now, as you know from your days at the CBI, Susan, when we did research, a lot of people actually quite like working in flexible ways. When I was at the REC, we looked at some of the, when there were problems, what was causing that problem. And often it's just how you treat people. And I think one of the trends I expect to start, we'll see more of, is this idea of managing a whole workforce ecosystem. So you're not just managing your permanent employees well, you're managing your contractors well, you're managing your freelance staff well, you're managing your temporary workers well. And it makes absolute sense. It makes sense because you'll get better performance. But what is the point if I'm a big employer spending all that money on being seen as a great place to work, being seen as having a good employer brand, if I'm not treating my temporary contract staff well? So that's something I expect to see continue. More employers are starting to do surveys of their temporary staff. How do you feel about this place to work, etc. And I think that will be a trend. So again, going back to the theme about future leaders will be those that can manage a whole workforce ecosystem, not just a permanent workforce.
Yeah. I mean, I was, it's a little anecdote. I was talking to an American bank, and they'd outsourced their security staff. But their security staff, for example, if they were, if they weren't taking the 2 weeks off, they weren't isolating if they'd been in contact with them, because their terms just gave them SSP if they were lucky. So the bank had to step in order to say, well, we don't want the people who are delivering our security, to the extent there are people coming into the office, not able to actually isolate. So, you can't just see your workforce, your temporary workforce, or indeed your outsourced workforce, as just somehow part of the peripheral that you don't need to worry about.
No, and you need to make sure you're working with good providers. So again, one thing that crisis has shown is how important it is to make sure the temporary workers are looked after. So there's a whole debate around protective equipment for temporary staff, etc. But again, working closely with good recruiters who can make sure that everything's been done to ensure the workers are informed, they're looked after. So I think that'll be a definite trend over the coming years for sure.
David?
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think the whole idea of an ecosystem, a platform of collaborators, is the way ahead, number one. I think there is an issue about owning the culture, creating the culture of the organization with a multiple engaged, I don't mean multiple engaged, multiple owned workforce, if you like. So if you've got short-term, medium-term, long-term third parties, plus your own people, the new normal, which I'm going to use that phrase once only, is a blend of real and virtual. We're currently in lockdown normal, so this isn't a thing to judge. This is not what people love, but the new version is a much more interesting blend of being human when you're together and really being human, not sending emails to each other, and doing human things, and being remote when you want to be remote. I remember back in 2009, Orange funded a survey. It said, where would you live if you didn't have to be near work? And it was really interesting. All the young kids went to London. Everybody else went to where they would retire. So, and everybody left Birmingham, I'm afraid. So, house prices were paid to that. But, the issue was there. But on that whole, the issue of treating people the same, there will be a time, I'm fairly sure, when people won't know who are employees and who are third parties. It will not be obvious at all in teams. Most people working on projects in so many ways in the knowledge economy. So, you don't really know where someone's popped up from either a different part of the company or a different organization to inject the skills you need or the external attitude. And, I remember speaking about 5 years ago, I've just worked it out while I was sitting here in New York, Berlin, and somewhere else. I can't remember where it was now, thinking about it, on workplace benefits. Extending those from employees to preferred third parties, and then potentially to all third parties, changes the nature of engaging with people. Because if you've got somebody you really love and like and want them to stay engaged, why don't you provide them with a very similar package of benefits that you give to full-time employees? So that whole world is morphing and blending in a very dynamic way. And I think we'll see a lot more of that. Oh, we've lost Susan.
We seem to have lost Susan, so I'm sure she'll be back with us shortly. So does anybody want to pick up any points there?
I was just reflecting that we've got a few questions in the Q&A.
Yes,
we have. Yes. Why don't we have a look at those? So if I just read them out for you. The first one was from John Andrews. He's asking, what do the panelists foresee the implication to be for employment with announcements such as Salesforce said it no longer makes sense to expect employees to work in the office 8 hours a day and still do their best work? So what's your position on remote working and how motivated people are working from home? What's been the impact of remote working? David?
But can I just say, we can't really call it working from home because we have to stay home. Bassins and taverns about 12 years ago, 13 years ago, before the government shut them down effectively, they were going to use their upper rooms as places where people in their localities can work. So the idea is that British people get a lot of value from workplace relationships. If you have a lot of transfer between organizations, then you're losing those on a regular basis. But if you all work together in the upper room of a pub or a business center in your village or town, your colleagues remain your colleagues for as many years as you like. So I don't think it's working from home, it's working remotely. And I don't think it's working from home in lockdown normal. I think it's a new relationship-based normal where people who prefer human contact will get more human contact. People who prefer a way of life that's more remote and it fits the organization will work more remote. So it's really exciting looking at, now the genie's out the bottle and we sort of work out, generally speaking, if it can be done, why don't we do it? We're going to see in the next 4 or 5 years, or probably the next 2 in truth, a reform of how we do work and how we use office space.
Susan, we're glad to have you back with us. We were just looking at the Q&A because we're about 10 minutes away from the finish time. So I thought we'd just have a quick look at the Q&A whilst you were away. Do you want to take it on from there? So we were just responding to John Andrews' question about working from home.
Yeah. Okay. Does anybody else want to contribute to that while I just catch up with where we are?
Can I just oh, sorry. Should I just
no, go Wendy, go.
Thanks. Yeah. So agreed with David. What organisations and individuals have missed is the informal bump into somebody in the office, overhear a conversation. They've missed that on a social basis, but also that also generates ideas and connectivity in a way that working remotely doesn't. So I know a number of organisations are thinking about how do you plan that time in and how do you use office space or indeed other communal space to kind of bring people in. There are lots of people that have worked more productively remotely, but that isn't the answer. Actually, sometimes you need to bring the introvert into the room physically, if you like, to kind of create the best outcome. So I think that we will see some differences. The other thing I think that is going to happen is that on the back of that, and indeed the working patterns, Tom was saying interim work and others, is that, you've got a lot of people, young people as well as, all ages actually, who've got these kind of either side hustles, as they call them, going on. They do other things, and how you fit that within a more traditional work, how do you allow that to happen? And that, I think that's another thing that is going to come into the forefront over the next few years. Sorry, Tom.
And I think it's a great theme because it goes back to the whole leadership management challenge, because essentially you're raising the bar, aren't you? Mm-hmm. So how do you create team culture, cohesion with people? You just got to be very organized as well, haven't you, to sort of make sure that certain people are coming into the workplace at a certain time. So I think it does raise the bar. But you're seeing some real innovations. So how do you build? Because you're right, you lose the sort of more informal parts of it, don't you? So how do you create almost little social gatherings online and make that fun and not too forced? And I think it's creating challenges. But again, I do think it's raising the bar on future leaders and managers.
That's the point, isn't it, Tom? I'm 100% with you. My experience, we had a very creative head of HR in my big corporate days. And in 1995, I had 65 people out of my team working remotely and working from home. It started in Paisley Bridge, actually. Somebody just wanted to stay there more often. He was coding, so who cared where he was? So, but I was useless at remote management. I genuinely forgot. If I didn't see someone, I forgot them. So my PA, who was brilliant, Bonnie, I remember her name so well because she was brilliant. She'd remind me to make contact with people. So actually, it's all about the headspace of the person who's got the emotional skills and the ability to have light touch communication with groups and individuals. I think it's a brand new skill.
Yeah, spot on.
Yeah, and it's not one that people are not, managers sometimes find it difficult to let go.
Yeah.
It's all very well saying we're focused on outcomes, but sometimes it just becomes, back to Tom's point about the CV, it becomes the job description, it just becomes a list of tasks.
And also Wendy mentioned before this idea of purpose. So purpose creates sort of trust, creates belonging. That will be more important because you're going to have to trust people, and part of that I think is having common purpose, isn't it? And I think that'll be a big challenge.
Well, we haven't got that long to go. Can I just ask you give me your thoughts about how optimistic you are in terms of the challenges we face, in the UK, but also with the large multinational companies we work with. Because if we look at the economic forecast, the UK, look at the latest IMF figures, the UK is not too far off, which is different to some of our EU competitors. But I mean, how optimistic are you then when you're looking ahead? Let's start with Wendy.
I'm an optimist by nature, so yes, I am optimistic, but I do think that this is a challenging period and a deeply wounding period for people. So I think you have to, as you pointed out earlier, Susan, recognise that this is a defining moment for the world, and so I think it will require quite a lot of thoughtful leadership to both deliver on the possibilities, but also to think about the sort of putting the kind of human aspects back into it. I think it will be again an opportunity to focus on some of the important things that back to focusing on environmental issues, focusing on the kind of social aspects, and and the kind of good governance stuff to make sure that businesses and organizations are run well.
Yeah, that were all good points. David, what about you?
I agree with that entirely. I am an optimist, very much an optimist. I can see the sunlit uplands of great things coming, but it's going to be a difficult road for incumbents because there is so much. We're leaving the digital age and we are entering the intelligent age. And if folk are still focusing on automating existing processes, they've missed the point and they'll put themselves at risk. So the new jobs, the new era, the new technologies are fantastic. We are post-Brexit. We don't know what we will be like in the next 4 or 5 years. Does that, a friend of mine is an economist. You ask 12 economists for a review. I said to him, you get 13 answers. He said, no, it's more like 15. So, we don't really know where we'll be. The IMF invariably gets us wrong and downplays us. So I think that's that helpful, quite frankly.
Well.
Okay. Well, we'll have another debate about that another time.
Yeah, that's the next topic. Yeah.
But yeah, of course it is. But I mean, I would just say Amara's law, I think, is we always overestimate the impact of technology in the short term and we underestimate in the long term. This is not a time to get it wrong. This is a time to have some really clear thinking about the sorts of things that we can become preeminent as a nation and then export that to the world, if you like, or exploit it. And very much of it's delivered by technology. and nearly every job in some degree is touched by technology. So I'm excited about what's coming. I think for a lot of leaders, the incumbent leaders, it's incredibly worrying. But as a nation, well, I guess we'll survive with new players and replacements. And final thought is we're average age 42, getting ready for a midlife crisis, and India's 25 just going to work. So we've got to continue and up our game and get that energy back into our thinking. We've been buffeted for a decade now, one way or the other. It's time to take a deep breath, get some visionary leadership. I don't know where we get that from, by the way, and start moving forward.
Yeah, so it's you're excited, but you're worried. Got some worries. Yeah, those visionary leaders seem to be in a bit short supply, but they'll come from the places we probably least expect. Just like some of those technological changes are going to come from the places that we possibly don't anticipate. Tom, few thoughts from you to end up.
Yeah, I think we're starting to ask ourselves the right questions, which is good. So what is a successful jobs market, for example? And historically, it's always been measured on the unemployment stats, on the employment stats, and increasingly it's not just going to be about that. It's about satisfaction with your job. It's about progression opportunities. It's about inclusion. So that's starting to change. And then if I look at it on a company basis, there's a lot of talk about stakeholder capitalism, and there was a lot of talk about that at Davos this year, and people are quite skeptical about it. But I'm seeing that's really start to permeate. So going back to David's theme about doing things differently, I think increasingly it's not just about what we do, it's about how we do it. And I think that will start to really make an impact, and it will make an impact in terms of how businesses look after their workers, how they manage their supply chains. I mean, we've done a lot of work over the years in this country on the reputation of business, but I don't think we respect ourselves enough across supply chains, really, when you look at it. So I think things are starting to move on. And I think some of one point we didn't touch on, I think we're starting to see some change in the way we build the future generation. So schools are doing a lot of work around growth mindset. I think that the current challenges, again, will perhaps build resilience within a future generation of workers. But that whole theme of building a better bridge between education and this changing world of work, I think is something that remains a big, big challenge, but I'm starting to see some progress on.
Okay, so I think like Wendy, then we're all broadly optimist. I think we need to pat ourselves on the back for what we've achieved. I think we sometimes worry too much actually about the state of the UK. I think we have risen to the challenges. We are rising to the challenges. There's plenty of them. We're not where we want to be. I want to remind everybody that David has posted the survey to complete. It's on the website. I think those of us who've done it have found it really helpful and informative. So I'd encourage you to do that. I want to say thank you to all the speakers, Wendy, David, Tom, thank you all very much. Thank you to David behind the scenes as well, especially coping with the unexpected. Just to tell everybody or remind everybody that there's a feedback form that we'd like you to, or IORMA would like you to fill in. The next IORMA webinar is in 2 weeks' time. I'd encourage you to participate. There are some excellent ones around. Hopefully there's going to be one that's going to answer the economic challenges, David. I would just ask our speakers just to hang on for a minute. We'll just have a little debrief ourselves. But I just want to say thank you very much to everybody for participating. I had some good questions as well. So thank you and goodbye to all our listeners.
Thank you.